In the next section of the book, then, Deleuze begins to work out his critique of the dogmatic image of thought. The image of thought. The typical image of thought is based on uh, the convention of the association of thinking with recognition, truth and falsehood. And falsehood is simply defined as error, that which is opposed to the true. And thinking is predicated on the assumption that everyone has a basic common sense that enables them to recognize the true when they see it, truth versus falsehood. And that this model is based on a simple matching theory of recognition, the old adequatio theory of the agreement of knowledge with its object. And so this theory of recognition, Deleuze objects to by saying that the theory of recognition, the problem with it is that it doesn't allow for the emergence of anything new. He says that true philosophy doesn't have to do with recognition so much as it has to do with new and hitherto unprecedented forms of thinking that move one out of conventionalities, because to recognize is not to increase your thinking or to move into new areas, but simply to confirm what you already know. And this was the whole basis of the Platonic model of knowledge that he attacks here, the idea in Plato of the reminiscence of forms, that knowledge simply consists within us of the awakening of forms that were there because we pre-existed the spatio-temporal world, in a world where we had knowledge of the forms imprinted upon the structure of our souls, and we simply forget about them. So that the process of knowledge, as it's shown, for example, when Socrates teaches the slave boy to awaken his knowledge about how to solve a geometrical proof, is that the knowledge is already there, it's innate, and we simply remember it. It's the theory of reminiscence, which is another variation of this recognition model. For Descartes, it's not reminiscence, it becomes the idea of innate ideas, that ideas like God and the soul are innate. They're in us, and they simply have to be brought forth. Deleuze rejects all this, and he says that what it does is it confines thought to conventions and banalities and conventionalities that prevent the emergence of anything radically new coming into one's thought space. So this is part of the dogmatic image of thought. And the other problem with the traditional image of thought, the dogmatic image of thought, is that the only negative that it allows room for is error, that which is not true. And he says, so the result of this is that it overlooks all these other wayward forms of human thinking that don't fit into this schema, like, for example, mental illness, insanity, stupidity, cowardice, banalities, going on too long about the wrong point, all these other things, or paradoxes, all these other things that are different forms of wayward thinking that don't fit into this truth and falsehood paradigm. And he opposes this to paradox. Paradox, for example, is something that's completely different from mere truth and falsehood. You can make a statement that may not necessarily be, that can make sense, but it may not conform to the true or false paradigm, but yet it can make sense nonetheless. So, and this is something that he'll develop later in the next book, Logic of Sense. So these are parts of these are various objections to the traditional dogmatic image of thought, and they basically are part of this sort of French postmodern late 60s objection to traditional bourgeois conventional thought systems, middle-class thought systems, and old ideas. This is his version of turning philosophy upside down and trying to shake something new out of it. And indeed, we begin to see in the next chapter, as he moves into his theory of ideas, what he's talking about is his own ontology here is something radically new, I think. We do find, along the principle of the eternal return, echoes with older thought systems, like Plotinus, for example. But as we'll see in a moment, it really is something new and fresh. So in the next chapter, he moves into the idea of ideas, his idea of ideas, and he says that what ideas are ideas, and this is idea with a capital I, like the Platonic ideas, except that they're different in that they are not unities, and they're not many, and they're not one. They're actually multiplicities of differential relations. Ideas are, he says, multiplicities of differential relations, and this is beginning to build his theory of an ontology of difference. Differential relations are built into the structure of every idea, and ideas actually incarnate themselves in the physical world. Now we're beginning to move into the startling idea system of Deleuze here when he says this, when he maintains that he develops this ontology of the idea that ideas make everything that we see and experience in the physical world possible. Everything is the incarnation of an idea. And this makes him radically different from the tradition of idealistic philosophy from Descartes down through the Germans, with the possible exception of Schopenhauer, who is a little different. Schopenhauer did have the idea that Platonic ideas incarnate themselves in matter, even though his philosophy is radically solipsistic in its idea that the world is my representation and it basically is confined to the cavern of my own human skull, and that's all I've got to work with. Deleuze isn't interested in confining the world to the human skull. He wants to know how things come into being. So he's got this complex philosophy of morphogenesis in which ideas incarnate themselves in matter. And they do that in the following way. We can imagine his version of the world as a kind of threefold schema of the virtual, the intensive, and the extensive. So with respect to ideas, ideas are virtual, but he doesn't mean to oppose the virtual with the real. The virtual is just as real as the physical things are in the physical world. It's not something that isn't real. The virtual is real. But this is where the ideas sort of exist as these bundles of multiplicities of differential relations that are structured and actualized through the various spatio-temporal dynamisms of the physical world, what he calls the world of extensivity, extensions. And extensivity is the world as it appears to us. It's the world of actualized forms, or rather the world as it is, of actualized forms, the realm of actualized forms and forms. So this is what was traditionally thought of as primary and secondary qualities: motion, figure, shape, extension, solidity, rest. All the physical qualities of the world are extensions, extensivity. But what makes how an idea becomes incarnate in the world of extension is by means of intention, the intensive world, the realm of intensivities. And he says that intensivity differs from extensivity by virtue of the fact that things in the realm of extension can be divided. You can take, for example, a body of water, let's say, and you can cut it in half, and you have two different volumes of water. But let's say the temperature of the water, and therefore this is an intensity. The temperature of the water is 90 degrees. When you divide it in half, you still have a 90-degree temperature. It's not divided into two 45-degree temperatures. And so intensity is that which cannot be divided without changing the nature of the system. So, for example, if we wanted to change the intensity of the water's temperature, we would have to apply heat to it, and the heat would make the temperature rise, but then that would induce a phase change so that it's no longer the same system. So this is what he means by intention. Intention is the realm of these hidden properties that are concealed by the primary and secondary qualities of the physical world, of the actual real world. And these intensities are things like temperature, temperature differences, differences in speed, differences in rate of change, rate of flow, these intensities that are part of the morphogenetic realm of what Conrad Waddington used to call creodes. Creodes are these sort of non-physical warps and topologies that make the physical world possible. And so Deleuze is actually, what he's doing here is he's building a sort of philosophical equivalent to what the biologist Rupert Sheldrake popularized as the morphogenetic fields. The morphogenetic fields are these invisible fields that shape everything, that give, and what Sheldrake had said was that the laws of nature are not actually laws, they're simply the habits of nature, and the laws appear the more stable the longer those habits have been going on. So they appear to be laws, but they're just really habits that have sunken into a state of inertia. But the problem with Sheldrake's system is that it failed to account for novelty. It failed to account for how it was. Now remember, with Deleuze we already had the persistence of the past as the two syntheses of the passive synthesis of habit and the active synthesis of memory, but he counters that with the eruption of empty time that blows apart the circle and the sense of the self. You get the dissolved self, the Nietzschean Dionysian dissolved self that is blown apart by the impact of the new. And so Sheldrake had trouble in his system accounting for how novelty emerges. But Deleuze answers that, not that he was aware of Sheldrake, but just Sheldrake was borrowing a similar set of ideas from science. René Thom's structural stability and morphogenesis, for example, and shows how novelty is possible. And the way in which everything works in terms of morphogenesis is that the process by way of which the idea incarnates itself in forms is what he calls differentiation, differentiation with a C. Differentiation with a T refers to the virtual state of the relations in the ideas themselves, their virtual status of the bundle of relations that are not necessarily distinct, they're usually indistinct. That's differentiation. But the intensities then differentiate, that is to say, they actualize the possible. The virtual is actualized into the physical world through the process of differentiation. So we begin to see the ontology of difference that he's building here. Everything comes into being out of differentiation. And by difference, he says, it does not mean diversity. Difference does not refer to diversity. It refers to intensity, differentials between relations, and hence intensities. This is also morphogenesis, the process of the way in which nature creates things that are new through this process. And the other aspect of it is that he says that the process of differentiation has to be distinguished from explication or individuation, which is proper to the middle realm, the realm of intensity. In intensity, what has to happen first, in order for a singularity, ideas are universal singularities. In order for them to, as are individuals in nature, they're all individual singularities. In order for that to happen, you have to have an individuation first. So intensities actually produce through the process of explication fields of intensities, rather fields of individuation. And so an individuated field has to appear, and it's based on the tension between two heterogeneous sets of differential relations that are then brought together such that the individuated field that is produced, the individual rather that is produced, is sort of half real and half virtual. So that every form that comes into being is a kind of, carries along with it the virtual ghost of its morphogenetic double. So in the virtual aspect of every form always contains more possibilities within it than the actualized form ever actually actualizes. And so this becomes, as you can see, as anyone who's read Thousand Plateaus, this later becomes the body without organs and the plane of consistency. The plane of consistency is the realm of intensities and plateaus and morphogenesis and transformations of form, the realm of embryogenesis, where inside the womb weird things happen to the embryo. The embryo is capable of doing things, stretching and elongating and folding matter over in ways that it simply cannot do as an adult, and that would tear an adult skeleton to pieces. So there are all these other intensities and differential relations and genetic possibilities that are there within the embryogenetic process than are ever manifested in the actual form itself. And so the body without organs later simply becomes this field of individuation, which is the same thing as the Sheldrakean morphogenetic field, more or less, or Waddington's creodes, only as applied to the individual form, becomes the body without organs. And because the body without organs contains many more possibilities within it than the actual physical human body ever actualizes, the human body can always return back to that state of potentiality to reactivate other potentials, to go back to it if need be and reconstruct a new body, a new type of body without organs. And so in Thousand Plateaus we have the plane of consistency and the plane of organization. The plane of organization is the realm of substance and matter, of form, the realm of organized form, what corresponds here in difference and repetition to extension, the realm of extension with its primary and secondary qualities. And so you can see what later becomes worked out in A Thousand Plateaus in a much more complicated way is already being worked out here in difference and repetition. So we have the idea. Ideas are they're multiplicities, sets of differential relations, so they're already based on difference there to begin with. And via the realm of intensities, which produce morphogenetic fields, although that's not a term he uses, they produce fields of individuation, individuals are produced, and extensities are produced. Every individual precedes a differentiation, the production of a form. First you have to have the individual form field, the virtual field that then manifests itself in space-time as form. Very similar here to Hindu metaphysics. It's not that far off, and I think a good future project for anyone interested in good ideas for PhD projects might be to compare Indian epistemology and ontology and the Upanishads with Deleuze's theory of morphogenesis, because they're very similar. There we have the idea, in Hindu metaphysics you have the idea of Brahman as the ultimate one. It's not a multiplicity, but it is nonetheless the ultimate one, the ultimate reality that through Maya, which corresponds to his field of intensity, is manifest in the field of space-time as nama rupa, the names and forms that every concrete thing has. Very similar here to what Deleuze is talking about. I'm sure Deleuze didn't know anything about Indian metaphysics, but it's interesting how close he comes to that same paradigm, which was something that Rupert Sheldrake had also addressed. He had gone to India and lived there for a while, and his philosophy is a more conscious attempt to translate Indian metaphysics into Western philosophy than Deleuze is, who apparently wasn't aware of Indian metaphysics. But it would make an interesting study for anyone interested in a research paper. So, so then we get